My name is, everybody say hi to somebody? Good. All right, my name is Michael Heidel. I'm one of the teaching pastors, there's a few of us that teach here. And so this morning, we're going to have fun this morning, but it's going to be kind of a little bit of a testing time at the same time, which is always good, you know? You don't know what your faith level is like until it's been tested. It's not faith until it's tested. So there's going to be some of that testing in our lives that we go through. So we're on this series right now, and it's called Culture Wars. I forgot. I kept thinking. See, Kevin's got in the notes Star Wars. Cue the Star Wars music. So I'm thinking Star Wars, and I try to know what's the other word we're supposed to use. And it's Culture Wars. It's how do you thrive in a culture that is anti-God, you know, that's anti-Christ. So how do you thrive in that? And so 2 weeks ago, he started us in Daniel, looking at the book of Daniel, looking at Daniel and the three other Hebrew boys. And then last week, we got to see Joel Seymour. It was a stream view. And he talked about the prodigal son. And we call it the prodigal son, but the true title for that message is The Incredible Father. Because in that story, we think about the prodigal son, the son that went away and asked for the inheritance, which basically says, Dad, you're dead. Give me my inheritance. You're dead to me. Give me my inheritance. And then he went and he squandered it, right? And then we think, well, he had his epiphany moment when he's out in the pig pen. And he's like, oh, I'll go back and be a servant in my father's house. And that wasn't the real epiphany, because he was still going back to be a slave. His older brother thought he was a slave. The real epiphany is when he was walking up to tell his dad, I will be a slave for you. And his dad ignored him and threw the robe over him, put the ring on his finger. All of those symbolize something in that culture. Put the sandals on his feet. He's saying, you're not a slave, you're my son. Don't you understand? You're my son. And then the older brother, he was just as prodigal as the younger brother, because even though he lived in the household, he wasn't a son, he was a slave. He thought he was a slave his whole life. Didn't I do all this for you? Didn't I work for you? And I didn't even get a young goat to go have the party with my friends. And then this other son of yours, didn't even call him his brother, son of yours comes home and you try and celebrate him. And his father said, son, all that I have is yours and it's always been yours. But you keep acting like a slave. So today, as we're kind of continuing on the culture wars, we're going to be looking at three other boys. Now, those two sons lived in their father's house and thought they were slaves. The three boys we're going to look at this morning were stripped of their father's house, lived in a foreign land, stripped of everything that they could call home, and yet they knew their father. They trusted their father. So the comparison there is, it's not where you live, it's where you live. It's where you live. It's not your culture that tells you who you are, it's your father that tells you who you are. You can live in a perfect culture. Those two prodigals, their dad had some money. They lived in a perfect culture, but they didn't know who they were. But the three boys I'm going to talk about this morning, they got stripped of all that. They lived in a culture that took them away from everything they knew comfortably, and they had to learn a new language. They had to go through all of this in a new culture, and yet they knew their father. So it doesn't matter where you live, it's who you recognize yourself to be. See, even when we touch on Daniel 1, we look at those boys. With Daniel and I can't remember the other three boys' names. It's hard. There's Misha, there's Mishael. I got it written down. I'll find it later. Yeah, well, that was the names they were given. They were given those names, but their original Hebrew names are the names they had to give up to get to those other given names. So they were kind of like stripped of their identity. And I have a friend that tells me, a pastor friend, And he always tells me when I start to, everything I do, every time I'm teaching, I'm always coming back to identity. I'm always saying identity takes us to destiny. Destination is the place we end up. Destiny is the path we take getting there. Identity determines our destiny, determines our path we take getting there. He says, well, you're always talking about identity because that's your story of coming into identity. And I thought, no, I always talk about identity because that's where it's at. It all happened in the garden. That's where it all went sideways, was in the garden with Adam and with Eve. And I was saying, that's where we lost our identity, our true identity. But no, check that. We never lost our true identity. We just put on a false identity. And we began to walk around in this false identity, this fallen identity. Our true identity is still in us. Our true recognition of who and how the Father sees us is still in us. But we listen to the culture, the Babylonian culture, tell us who we are. And we've taken on those new names that the Babylonian culture has given us. And we start walking that destiny instead of letting go of that and getting to know who we are. So this morning, I'm going to talk about those three boys who were forced to change their name. Oh, there it is. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And they were forced to change their names to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Or as I like to call them, Rack, Shack, and Benny. We got that slide? There it is. Rack, Shack, and Benny. One fiery furnace, three brave veggies. That's what we're talking about. These three, dealing with peer pressure. So Rack, Shack, and Benny. So when I start talking about Rack, Shack, and Benny, you know who I'm talking about. All right. So as the three questions we're going to be looking at this morning, we've been looking at all month, is that how do we spiritually thrive in a culture that is anti-God? How do we stand strong in a culture that is blatantly undermining Christian beliefs and Christian values? And have you ever had a line in the sand moment regarding your faith? Good stuff. So in Daniel 3, I'm going to read, Kevin and I were going back and forth as we were preparing, because he's actually at Downtown Vineyard, giving the same message. It's going to sound way different than mine because it's Kevin and I'm Michael, and so it's going to sound different. But we were going back and forth, and as we were reading through Daniel, trying to figure out what verses do we pull out of that to tell the story. And as we kept going along, we kept realizing, got to leave that in there. Got to leave that in there. Got to leave that in there. And we realized the story tells itself. So I'm going to read Daniel 3, 12 through 30. So it's a long section. You guys can read along with me. But I'm going to read it, and we're going to get this out here to tell the story. All right, Daniel 3:12. But there are some Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Remember, their names have been changed. Rack, Shack, and Benny, whom you have put in charge of the province of Babylon. They pay no attention to you, your majesty. They refuse to serve your God and do not worship the golden statue you have set up. See, to do a little preface here, the king Nebuchadnezzar, he set this huge gold statue, and he was making everybody, when you hear the music, cue the music. When you hear the music, you're supposed to worship this statue. Fall down and worship this statue. Well, there are these three boys that said, no, we're not going to do it. We're not going to change that part of our culture. So verse 13, then Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage and ordered that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him. When they were brought in, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or to worship the gold statue I have set up? I will give you one more chance to bow down and worship the statue I have made when you hear the sound of the musical instruments. But if you refuse, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. And then what God will be able to rescue from my power? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty, still respect. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up." Nebuchadnezzar was so furious with Rakshak and Benny that his face became distorted with rage. He commanded that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than usual. Then he ordered some of the strongest men in his army to bind Rakshak and Benny and throw them into the blazing furnace. So they tied them up and threw them into the furnace, fully dressed in their pants, turbans, robes, and other garments. And because the king, in his anger, had demanded such a hot fire in the furnace, the flames killed the soldiers as they threw the 3 men in. So Rakshak and Benny were securely tied and fell into the roaring flames. But suddenly, Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, "Didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace?" "Yes, Your Majesty, we certainly did," they replied. "Look," Nebuchadnezzar shouted, "I see 4 men unbound, walking around in the furnace unharmed, and the 4th looks like your God." The original translation says, "looks like the Son of God." Then Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could to the door of the flaming furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire. Then the high officers, officials, governors, and advisors crowded around them and saw that the fire had not touched them. Not a hair on their head was singed, and their clothing was not scorched. They didn't even smell like smoke. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel to rescue his servants who trusted in him. They defied the king's command and were willing to die rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make this decree. If any people, whatever their race or nation or language, speak a word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they will be torn limb from limb, and their houses will be turned into heaps of rubble. There is no other God who can rescue like this." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to even higher positions in the province of Babylon. It's a good story. You know, what could you possibly pull out of that story and say, okay, we're just going to talk about this? It encapsulates the whole thing of where these boys came from and what they faced. Now, before you get to a fiery furnace encounter, we need to back up to find out how they got to that place. How did they get to this place where they said, we're not going to bow down and worship your gods. We're not going to worship your statue. Our God will rescue us. But even if he doesn't, how do you get to that place? God's going to save me from this. But even if he doesn't, I'm going to trust my God. I'm going to trust my Father. There's only one way to get that. You don't give your life to God on Tuesday, and then on Wednesday, you're ready for the furnace. That does not happen. There is prep time. There is time between God, my life is yours, and my God will rescue me, but even if he doesn't. There is time in between there. There's prep time in between there. So the questions that we are faced today is how do we spiritually thrive in a culture that is anti-God? Point 1, when we prepare in private so we can stand strong in public. For us to spiritually thrive in a culture that is anti-God, we must start with our preparation. Thriving spiritually starts in our private preparation. So how do we prepare ourselves spiritually against a culture that doesn't value God? It begins in our face-to-face relationship with God. See, I have the 3 chairs, and those that have seen me teach and deliver message and everything know that this represents Father, Son, Spirit. And the reason they're like this is because John, in his book, John 1:1-3, says that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and all things were created through him, and apart from him, nothing was created. That word with is pros, which means face-to-face. So in the beginning, there was a face-to-face relationship already happening. It always comes back to a face-to-face relationship. So how do we prepare in a culture that is anti-God? We start in the beginning. We come back to this face-to-face relationship. We come back to this face-to-face relationship where we are in a face-to-face with our Father. Not afraid of our Father, because we've learned to trust him. Love is given, but trust is earned. And he knows we don't trust him. Every day that you wake up, he is working diligently to earn your trust that day. And he never tires of working to earn your trust. And each day that goes by, we trust just a little bit more and a little bit more. He doesn't just throw us into this blazing public furnace fire without first some time spent earning our trust so that we can trust him in that. Otherwise, we're going to say, our God will rescue us. And then if he doesn't, I'll go ahead and bow down. We come to this place of saying, our God, our Father will rescue us. But even if he doesn't, it's not going to change my mind about who I know my Father is. So let's back up to verse 1:8. Let's lay some foundation here for these three boys, Rakshak and Benny, and for Daniel. Daniel 1:8. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself, and the three boys were with him. They were all hanging out together. They were picked because they served in the tribe of Judah, which is important to know that they were a part of the worship team, so to speak, in the land of Israel, and so they were already kind of in a servant role. And then the Babylonians took over, annihilated them, destroyed everything, took captive everything, and took the Israelites as slaves. And so they took these four boys that were already in service to God, and they brought them in, and they were going to prepare them to serve Nebuchadnezzar, the king. So they had to go through a 3-year time of preparation to serve the king, Nebuchadnezzar. So this is in that preparation time of getting them ready to serve the Babylonian king. So here it is in Daniel 1:8. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. And he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now, when I think about the king's food, I was looking this up, and it means the royal dainty foods of the king's table is what it means, and not to defile themselves with the wine. So I started thinking about Burger King. It must have been like a fast food kind of food, I mean, it was royal and dainty, and it probably tasted really good, but it wasn't good for you, I mean, it just wasn't going to be that healthy thing. And so these boys decided that they just weren't going to participate in it. I think this was like a nudging that they got from their father. Let's earn some trust here. Let's start working on some more trust, because the fire's coming. You don't know it. I know it, but the fire's coming. So let's work on a little trust right now. Now, this was a private situation. We're not going to defile ourselves with the king's food. So they asked the chief priest, can we not have to participate? And the chief priest says, if the king finds out, because you guys are looking like really puny, he's going to have my head. And Daniel says, hey, give us 10 days. Let us try it for 10 days. And if we're looking puny, well, we'll see where we go from there. But just try it for 10 days. So for 10 days, they just did vegetables and water. And that's what they ate. And after 10 days, they were stronger than all the other ones. So the chief priest and Nebuchadnezzar never knew what was going on, because they weren't even Nebuchadnezzar's service yet. This was preparation for that service. So this was a private testing. This was a private time. This was a private face-to-face time. This was a private face-to-face time in preparation for they didn't know what, but they were in preparation for it. You don't know the fire that's coming to you. So if you don't spend time now preparing for the fire that comes to you, you're going to fail when the fire hits you. You're going to stumble and trip. You're going to blame God. You're going to throw in the towel. You're going to call it quits. And then Father God's going to say, that's okay, kid. Pick yourself up and let's get back in there. Let's earn some trust some more. Let's do some more face-to-face. It's when we get to the end of our ability, we start asking the right questions. As long as I got the answers, I'm not asking questions. And if I've got the answers, I'm not changing because I've already got the answer. It's when we come to that place of, I'm out of answers. I don't have the answers anymore. We come to that place of question. When we come to this face-to-face and start asking the question. And we start learning to trust our Father in that face-to-face. So these boys did that for 10 days. They just ate the vegetables. Chief priest for Nebuchadnezzar, chief's official, comes in and says, wow, you guys are looking good. So, okay, from now on, we're going to make that your regular diet. Just vegetables and water. And they continue to grow. And it took them 3 years of preparation before they ended up at Nebuchadnezzar. So 3 years of preparation before they got to the furnace. 3 years of practicing trust before they got to the place of testing that trust. Private time before they got to the public time. Daniel 1:7. What happened is they were practicing this face-to-face time. Daniel 1:7 says, these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. See, they spent this private time in a face-to-face time, and they began to change. They began to have knowledge that wasn't just available to anybody. Wow. See, they didn't keep they didn't keep picking up their social media devices, turning on their screens, and see what the culture is trying to tell them is going on around them. They spent time in a private time, face-to-face, to learn the truth. And then they walked away with this wisdom that just floored everybody around them. And in that, they kept getting promoted and promoted and promoted because they had the wisdom, because they spent time in the face-to-face. They weren't just, what does my culture say about me today? How many likes did I get? How many reposts did I get? It wasn't about what my culture is telling me. It was about private time that allowed them to stand in the furnace. We all right? All right. So here it is. So how do we survive in a culture that is anti-God? Well, we pick and choose how we participate in that culture. So the boys didn't eat the food from the king's table, which I don't think it was really about the food, because even Jesus told us it's not what goes into the body that defiles it, it's what comes out of the mouth that defiles it. So I don't think it was even just about the food. I think it was about a testing of obedience in this small private situation. Will you trust me in this small situation before we get to the big public display situation? So these little testings kept happening year after year after year. So it starts with the decision not to participate in the culture around you, or choosing how you participate in the culture around you. So, okay, here's a good one. How often do we hear gossip and then participate in it? How often does somebody offend us and we respond with anger or offense? That's participating in that culture. That's participating in the culture around us, because that's how they survive, is in that. So here it is. Galatians 5:22, and you don't have the slide for this, so don't worry about it. Galatians 5:22 talks about the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control. That's the fruit of the culture in this face-to-face relationship. So how do I participate in the culture around me? Anytime I am not walking in love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control. When I begin to, somebody comes at me with something that is non-love, and I respond with non-love, I've just participated in that culture. We will not be able to not participate if we haven't spent time here. When somebody comes at me and offends me, I have one of two choices. I can trust my Father to defend me, or I will defend myself. Those are the two choices we have. And we get to a point where it's a public offense, and then we have to say, my God, my Father will rescue me. But even if he doesn't, I'm not going to participate in that culture. That gets tough. That really gets tough. I told you it's been an exciting message, but a tough message. That's tough. But we are participating in the culture around us way more than we realize. We think, like, we're getting ready to celebrate the trunk or treat, right? And that's kind of like this Halloweenish kind of a thing. We think, well, I'm not going to participate in that because that's celebrating that culture around me. No. We're going to bring light into a darkened day is what we're going to do. We're going to bring the light in us to a place in a day and in a country that likes to celebrate the darkness, and we're going to be light in that darkness. And we're going to run into a bunch of people that celebrate the darkness, that we have the opportunity to be a light in their darkness. Because maybe they don't know there's another way of celebrating that day. You know, every holiday used to be spelled Holy space day. Our holy day. And now it's just holiday. And now we've turned all these holidays and just reasons to take Monday off. But they're holy days. Let's take these holy days back and let's bring light into them. Okay, so we have to decide how we're going to participate in the culture around us. Point 2, our circumstances will test our faith and trust in God. Always. Our circumstances will always trust our faith. Prep time, face-to-face time, private face-to-face time will always lead to a time of testing. Why? Because your Father wants to show you how much you're starting to trust him. He wants you to go through something and walk out of it going, wow, I handled that different than I used to handle that. And he's going, that's right. We are growing up. Way to go. And then you go, wow, okay, if I can trust him in that, I can trust him in more now. And then you start getting excited about your face-to-face time because you know your face-to-face time is producing something in you that is not participating in the culture around you. And it's called glory to glory to glory. We are changed and transformed. Like I said, you don't just give your life to God and then the next day you're ready for the furnace. That does not happen. You may face the furnace, but you may not stand in the furnace for very long. You may get knocked down in the furnace. And the furnace, what does the furnace look like? The furnace always looks like something that challenges you to give up love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control. If you can think about that fruit of the Spirit as being the culture of the heavenlies, anything that is not that is a furnace testing you. Anything that is not that is a furnace testing you to see your response to that. All right. Yeah, I've been talking about that verse already. Good. Oh, here we go. Yeah, we don't get it from a social media. I got to try and say my notes, sort of. I could just ramble for a while. So here it is. We either gain wisdom and strength from our private face-to-face time with our Abba Father, or we get pulled into the culture around us. Every single day you are faced with the culture around you trying to tell you how to live. Whether you realize it or not, you are faced with it. Every day you are being pulled by that culture. You're being pulled by that culture to put on the false identity and respond out of a false identity, which is anxiousness, fear, worry, anxiety, stress, anger. So every day we are called, every day we are facing a furnace of some sort. So the only way not to participate in the culture around us is to actively participate in a face-to-face life with Father God. No one can do it for you. You do not get it by coming here and sitting in these seats. It's a private time. You have 5 minutes sitting in the front of your car, have a face-to-face. Can you, when you get home, put that down for a minute before you put that on or before you pick that up and just spend 5 minutes, 2 minutes. Father, I just want to sit with you today, just for a couple minutes. Remind me how much you love me. I'm going through a whole lot right now, and I could really use your advice. Not what this is telling me, not what this is telling me. I could really use your advice on how to handle this situation. No one can do it for you. It's a face-to-face with you. Number three, our third point. God uses our circumstance to display his presence. In Daniel 3:25, Nebuchadnezzar says, "Look, I see 4 men unbound walking around in the fire, unharmed, and the fourth looks like the Son of God." Fourth looks like the Son of God. Now, here's a good one. So, let me read 3:27. And then the high officer and officials, governors, and advisors crowded around them and saw that the fire had not touched them. Not a hair on their heads was singed, and their clothing was not scorched. They didn't even smell like smoke. Wow. You ever been around a campfire? Well, if you have, I would be able to know because I'd smell it on you, right? You've been around somebody that's been around a campfire? Yeah, they smell like smoke, always. Well, these boys came out and didn't even smell like smoke. But what I want to point out to you is what was the one thing that got burnt up in the fire? Verse 25. You pull that back up there? "Look," Nebuchadnezzar shouted, "I see 4 men unbound." They were bound when they went up into the fire. The fire set them free from all the things that bind them. The one thing the fire does is it sets you free from those things that bind you. That's what the fire does. Don't be afraid of the fire. The fire is setting you free from those things that bind you to this culture. Comes in a face-to-face, then comes the fire, then comes the unbinding in the fire, and then what happens when you come out the other side? Let's look at point 4. This is what happens when you come out the other side. I skipped a lot of stuff in my notes because I just saw the time. So verse 4, or point 4, public display of God's presence leads to spiritually thriving. Every time you are faced in your culture to make a decision at work, in the store, in traffic, all the places that you are challenged by the fire, all the places that you are challenged to not walk in love, joy, peace, patience. Anytime you've lost your peace because of worry, you are being challenged in your culture, in your belief. You're being challenged. So the public display of God's presence leads to spiritual thriving. So in that fire, when you come out the other fire, the bounds, whatever they are, those things that hold you captive are gone. Daniel 3:29 and 30. "Therefore I make this decree, if any people, whatever their race or nation or language, speak a word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they will be torn limb from limb, and their houses will be burned into heaps of rubble. There is no other God who can rescue like this." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to even higher positions in the province of Babylon. Every time you face-to-face, private, face-to-face, it's going to lead to this testing of earning trust. Then it's going to lead to a public display of trust. I will not bow to this culture. I will not defend myself against this offense. My Father will rescue me. But even if he doesn't, I am not going to bow my knee to this culture and fight back against you with this. I'm going to walk in love and peace and patience and kindness. I'm going to be kind and gentle in this situation. And then when this public display happens and you didn't respond the way people thought you were going to respond, and you responded with love and peace and joy instead of with anger and hostility, and you respond in that in a public display, the promotion comes. Now people start asking you, how do you do that? They start talking to you about the culture that you are living in, because you obviously aren't living in this culture. How do you have such peace around you? And it begins to flow with you wherever you go. You begin to walk in that kind of peace. And people begin to recognize it. And then, Paul Young, you guys know Paul Young, the author of The Shack? I'm going to quote him. I don't have this. I'm going to quote him. He said, then you become, actually, no, it was Francois Dutoit that said it. He said, then you become, it doesn't matter who said it really, does it? I'm just going to tell you what he said. Then you become a thermostat and not a thermometer. The thermostat on the wall sets the temperature of the room. The thermometer only tells you what the temperature in the room is. So when you start going through the tests and the public displays, you become a thermostat that starts to change your culture. Instead of just having to be a part of, well, this is what the culture's telling me. This is what the culture's telling me. It's in this private face-to-face time, always leads to some private testing, which then leads to some public display, which then leads to some promotion where you start affecting your culture and your community and your valley and the people at work and the people in the store, and you begin to affect people. And do we want to change the world? Yes. It starts right here. It doesn't start with my evangelism, how many scriptures I quote, how well I can teach. It doesn't start with that. It starts right here. All the early apostles in the first church knew that. They knew it was right here. John, the apostle, alone on the Isle of Patmos, locked in the caves. Quiet, private, face-to-face with Father. Came out, wrote the book of Revelation, wrote 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, wrote the book of John. The apostle Paul, after he had his encounter, it didn't say that he went and hung out with in fact, he says, I didn't go hang out with the apostles. I didn't go hang out with those that have been around Jesus at that time. What I did is I went to the backside of the desert where nobody was around that knew anything about Jesus, and I learned about Christ in me. Then he came back, and he was no longer a thermometer, talking about the culture of the Jews and the Greeks and the Romans. He came back and changed their culture and began to set people free and be an influence in their life so that when Rome attacked Christians, they could stand up in the cathedral and face the lions. They could face it because they knew, they learned from Paul, it goes right here, this face-to-face. And nobody can do it for you. You got to do it yourself. You got to have that face-to-face yourself. So, there it is. 1, 2, 3, and 4. We must prepare in private before we can stand strong in public. Our circumstances will test our faith and trust in God. God uses our circumstance to display his presence through favor, faithfulness, freedom. And then, fourth, our public display of God's presence leads to thriving physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And I'm going to close with this quote from George MacDonald. There are good things God must delay giving. God must first make his child fit to receive and fit to have. George MacDonald was in the 1700s. You guys ever heard of C.S. Lewis? Author, children's books. C.S. Lewis calls George MacDonald his master. He's the one he learned from George MacDonald. George MacDonald is incredible. If you get a chance to read any of his stuff, read his stuff, trust me. It is well worth it. He was way out there. He was in the middle of the 1700s. And so some of his stuff will stretch you. But in that quote, there are good things God must delay giving. God must first make his child fit to receive and fit to have. I would not give a 16-year-old boy keys to a Ferrari. No way. That is way too much power. They don't know how to control that power. They don't know how to control that power. There are things your Father wants to give you. He wants to take you beyond where you are now. He wants you to be a thermostat in your culture. He wants you to change everybody and have an effect on everybody around you. And he has the power to give that to you. Talked about Peter, said even his shadow healed people. They were taking cloths that Peter had and handing them out, and people were getting healed with that. That's power. People were getting healed just by touching those cloths. That's power. There is authority that your Father wants to give you. First, he has to know that you're ready for it. He knows, but he knows that you're not. And he knows that you don't know that you're not ready. I know we always think we're ready, right? I remember thinking, I'm ready. And then the first opposition, oh my God, I don't know what's going on anymore. You don't even love me anymore, do you? I don't know. You know, fail. How many fires did I fail in, you know? And each of us have failed in our own fires. Each of us have had that encounter at work or on traffic or at the store or somebody cutting you off or somebody taking your place in that place, or we've had those encounters, and how do we respond? So that's what I want you to remember. Come on up, Matt, if you would, please. That's what I want you to remember about the culture. Galatians 5:22 and 23. Read it. Know what the fruit of the Spirit is. The fruit of a heavenly culture, right? You will know them by their fruit, Jesus says. You will know the culture of my people by the fruit that they are producing. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control. And you will know the culture of those that are not my people. Hate, discontent, strife, anxious, worry. So anytime you find yourself not walking in the fruit of the Spirit in that culture, you know that you are being tested with the other culture to try and take you out and cause you to forget who you are. So we're going to have some people in the back that can pray for you. You can sit in your seats and just have this face-to-face time. And we're going to finish off with this song. And I want you to think about your face-to-face time. And how often do you spend face-to-face time? And are you trying to fight a culture that is around you under your own power, or are you going face-to-face and knowing that it's not even your battle? So, go ahead.